Digital story for the 3rd grade about the Civil Rights Movement. The United States is a wonderful country, but we have parts of our history that we are not proud of. One of these things is the unequal treatment of our country's citizens. There was a time in this country where African Americans were blatantly treated as second-class citizens. Even after a law was passed that got rid of slavery in the United States on December 6, 1865, a very big moment in our country's history, African Americans were still not treated as equal citizens. When they were released from slavery, however, they didn't own any land to farm or any money to live freely. When they tried to get land, often white Americans would not let them. However, white Americans still were often violent towards African Americans for nothing besides their skin color, and no one would punish these crimes. Therefore, many African Americans decided to leave the South and go north to work, where they hoped things would be better. However, because many white Americans wouldn't hire them for good jobs, they still worked mostly as servants or in hard, dirty jobs that nobody wanted, like cleaning the streets. In addition, race-inspired violence still existed. Black Americans would be harmed simply because of the color of their skin. These crimes were called hate crimes. There were even laws that kept black and white Americans apart. These laws, called Jim Crow laws, prevented black Americans from using the same water fountains, eating in the same restaurants, sitting in the front of buses, and being in the same classes as white Americans. When African Americans were forced to be apart from whites, this was called segregation. However, this country was founded on the principle, all men are created equal, or all people are created equal. In 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court finally decided that segregation was no longer okay and decided to change the law. In the next several years, many people, black and white, fought to make sure that black Americans had the same rights as white Americans, that they were treated fairly and recognized as equally important human beings. This was called the Civil Rights Movement, and the people who fought for these rights were called civil rights activists. However, when we say civil rights activists fought for equality, they did not actually fight anyone because they did not use violence. Martin Luther King Jr. was a very important civil rights movement leader, and he insisted that people use peaceful ways to make change. Some of the ways that he encouraged people to create change during the civil rights movement were sit-ins, boycotts, and civil disobedience. Sit-ins are a form of protest in which people stay in one place, like a restaurant area serving whites only, and refuse to leave until their demands are met. A boycott is another form of protest when people team up and work together to avoid using, buying, or dealing with something. One famous boycott from the civil rights movement was the bus boycott. Black Americans were not allowed to sit in the front of the bus and were forced to give up their seat to a white person if the bus was too crowded. To create change, civil rights activists did not use the bus for over a year. Lastly, civil disobedience is when people purposefully disobey a law that they feel is unjust or goes against what is right. An example of this is when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white individual. In the end, the civil rights movement helped to bridge the equality gap between African American and Caucasian citizens. The U.S. government made more equal and fair laws like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed African Americans to vote, and the Civil Rights Act of 1968. What other changes do you see today?